I call John O'Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's a great pleasure to rise and take another call on this bill so quickly after we've had the second reading. And before we went to the dinner break, some of the members who are here will remember that I sort of talked about the importance of why we should have this legislation, talked about the importance of the game, talked about the importance of sport in New Zealand and people's ability to be able to watch it. So I don't want to rehash all the same stories that I told in my last speech, because I'm sure people don't want to hear about my cricket watching escapades of 1983. So I will try and focus a little bit more. I know Joe Hayes wants to hear about it. I'll have to tell you later, but that's all right. So given though the truncated process that we've had to do in order to meet the timelines associated with Rugby World Cup looming so quickly, I believe it's important tonight that in the absence of a committee of the whole House and in the absence of perhaps a longer period for submissions, that we do ensure that we cover the bases well and go through the bill very well in our second and third readings of this piece of legislation. And so I think where I want to start though is to really outline some of the key issues that we faced as a select committee as we went through this process. There was certainly a good level of debate, and I got to say, probably one of the most enjoyable experiences I've had since being in Parliament in terms of a select committee, in terms of people basically working constructively to try and find a way through to find a sensible outcome for what is probably going to be a reasonably important event, well, hopefully an extremely important event for New Zealand in a few weeks' time, but a very constructive select committee process where we explored the various upsides and downsides of having this kind of legislation. And I guess obviously the fact that we're all in so many numbers voting for this evening indicates that we've arrived at a point where we think we've achieved the right balance and that we're going to get a good piece of legislation that's going to serve the people of New Zealand well. I just want to stress again though that this bill is not about enabling people to drink. This is a bill that is about enabling people to take part in what is an important event in terms of a sporting sense, but also in terms of a community event. So this is what this is. Now, unfortunately, there aren't too many places available for people to watch this kind of thing in a public setting that aren't licensed premises. And so that's why we're addressing this through a licensed premise piece of legislation to enable people to go along, quietly enjoy the game. There'll be some shouting, I'm sure, particularly if we score a few tries. But that is the point of this now, is not to cut across the previous Sale and Supply of Liquor Act. No one's intending to do that. I don't think we're necessarily compromising the principles of the Act when for a short space of time we're going to allow places that are licensed to be able to be open to allow people to enjoy this event, very specific period of time for a very specific series of games and then move on. So I guess the first thing that came up really was dealing with what is wrong with the special licence process. And Mr Robertson, in his contribution just before me, said that there was concern, obviously, around some of the variations that we were seeing across the country and some of the conditions that were being put on with a sense of variation around the countryside when people were applying for special licences. And I think it's really critical that we get some sense of uniformity across the country. Some people were deeming that it wouldn't be a special event unless people were wearing costumes. It couldn't be a special event unless it was a ticketed event. And the difficulty is when I think of the special conditions or the special licence provisions within the existing Act, it doesn't necessarily deal, I don't think, with the idea of a mass thing that's happening right across the countryside and is going to affect multiple licensed outlets. Now, Mr Mitchell, in his second reading speech, talked about an event that he'd organised that had 17,000 people at it. Now, if someone was going to organise an event that had 17,000 people at that one event, at that one place, I think we would all say that's pretty easy. Well, it's not easy because he told us it's 35 pages to apply for it, but it's pretty direct, it's pretty noticeable what you would have to do in order to achieve that special licence. But actually, what we're going to get as a district licensing committee then would deal with that one licence. But potentially, what we would have is every licensed premise within a local authority area all applying for a special licence. Now, frankly, I think that's overly bureaucratic. They would all have to pay an extra fee for it. They would all have to do a whole lot of extra paperwork. You'd probably find that the local council would have to put on extra staff to deal with this influx of special licences. And so if by putting together a reasonably simple piece of legislation, we can ensure that there's a sense of uniformity, a sense of basic provisions as what's going to need to be put in place for people to televise these games, it seems eminently sensible to me. So I guess the question then was, why would we make it an amendment bill, excuse me, rather than an act in its own right? Now, of course, when we were weighing up the important principles that we needed to incorporate within this bill, what we wanted to make sure was that we didn't make it more permissive in the general sense for people than the current legislation. And so instead of actually trying to incorporate all of those facets of licences into this piece of legislation, it seemed much easier, much simpler and much more straightforward to sort of bolt this on to the current legislation rather than importing a whole lot of bits from the original sale of liquor, the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act into this one. And so for simple streamlining purposes, we wanted to do that. It means that the police, that district licensing, excuse me, inspectors will be policing essentially the same kinds of conditions as well as these extra ones that we've put in. They'll be able to ensure that people are trading safely, trading within the law and trading within the boundaries that we think as a society are appropriate. And so that's the purpose, if you like, for ensuring that this moves forward straightforward, is simple, easy to understand. People who have licences know how the Act works. They'll find this amendment in it, find out what they need to do. Simple, they're not having to go and look for a special piece of legislation. Now, I think the other important thing, and other speakers have touched on this, but I do want to pick up on it, is that not everybody who currently holds a liquor licence will automatically get an extension to their hours for the purposes of Rugby World Cup. We talked about this at great length in the committee, and I think there was pretty much universal agreement that if somebody in the last 12 months had breached their conditions or had their hours curtailed because they had been behaving in a way that was contrary to their licence or behaving in a way that was, more to the point, and contrary to the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act, i.e. serving a minor, serving somebody who's intoxicated or otherwise, would not get one of these special licences. We felt that it wasn't appropriate to reward somebody who in the last 12 months had shown a lack of responsibility in the way that they operated their premise. And so what we wanted to do was ensure that those people weren't then able to just carte blanche, have an open-ended licence and move forward. So that's one thing I think is really important to note, that not everybody is going to get one. Now, when it comes to the idea of trading hours, this again caused some complexity because, of course, the games don't necessarily run back to back to back. They don't start as soon as the other one finishes. There might be some time in between games. And so there was a bit of a conversation of us needing to work out what was the most appropriate way to deal with games that would be slightly spaced apart. And so what we've said is that given that it's going to be probably difficult for people to close down and open up again, got no issue. If there's more than a 2-hour gap, then absolutely licence holders are going to have to close down and reopen if there's more than a 2-hour gap between games that they are screening. But if there's less than 2 hours, given that they're allowed to be open for or serve drinks up for half an hour after the game and have everyone out within an hour, and then they're allowed to open up again an hour beforehand, it would seem a little bit ludicrous to make them shut down. So we, having looked through the agenda of the games, thought what's the right sort of a balance, and we said essentially if it's more than 2 hours between games, you will need to shut down and then open again. And I think that addresses some of the concerns of people who are concerned that people might arrive at a bar at 11 o'clock, stay there till 9 o'clock in the morning, and agreed that this wasn't necessarily completely in tune with what we were trying to achieve. That may well happen in terms of some of the games, but what we're trying to do is, where we can, minimise harm. So, Mr Speaker, I think we've done some really good work over the last couple of weeks. It's a challenging idea to put together some piece of legislation this quickly. I commend the work the Select Committee have done, and I commend this bill to the House.